Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. I'm Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and I'm bringing you a different sort of episode today. I usually focus on a research article or a person's career, but in this episode, I'm focusing on a broader topic, namely the science of math. And although I've had multiple guests on a single episode many times before, this episode is different because my two guests are not going to be on at the same time, and they're not co-authors together. Instead, my two guests are going to share opposing perspectives on the science of math. Now, I say opposing, but this doesn't have to be oppositional or antagonistic. What I'm striving for in this episode is a good faith conversation where we try to understand the intent and the background perspectives of the scholars involved in the science of math effort. And we also try to articulate and understand some of the concerns and criticisms that people have about science of math. In all of this, the goal is to have a serious and fair discussion without the demonization, the assigning of motivations, and without the us versus them mentality that often exists online and also has existed within math ed debates in the past and present. I'm sincerely grateful to my two guests because they completely lived up to these goals, as they shared some important points and perspectives, and although they do disagree and have differing interpretations on several things, the conversation was respectful and at times introspective as we realized that some of the critiques toward the other could also be directed toward oneself. So, first, you will hear Sarah Powell from the University of Texas, who is one of the leaders and creators of the Science of Math website, which is at thescienceofmath.com. She'll describe this in more detail, but if you aren't aware of it, the Science of Math is an effort by a group of education researchers to compile and share some materials about evidence-based mathematics teaching and learning. We will, of course, talk more about what is meant by evidence-based, but the Science of Math framing has gotten some traction in the realm of practice and policy, and there have been articles, books, and social media groups organized around this notion of trying to draw on certain kinds of evidence to cut through what can sometimes be the messiness or the mixed messages of math education. There has been some traction for science of math, but there are also many critiques. So, after Sarah shares an introduction and overview, I will then speak with Rachel Lambert from the University of California, Santa Barbara about some of the concerns, both with regard to the substance and also the scope of the science of math efforts. Then, in the third and final segment, I collect a few questions that arose from my conversation with Rachel, and I pose those questions to Sarah directly, to hear at least her own personal reaction to the points raised, but recognizing that the Science of Math group is only a loose affiliation and not a formalized organization, so Sarah at this point is basically just speaking for herself. I thank Sarah and Rachel for being willing to join me in this unconventional type of episode, and I hope listeners gain some insights about multiple perspectives here, and that you can make your own judgments about which points are the strongest or the most salient for your own context as a mathematics educator. So with that being said, let's get into the science of math with Sarah Powell, Rachel Lambert, and then Sarah again. My first guest is Sarah Powell, who is a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Sarah, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Hey, thanks, Sam. It's really a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have you back on the podcast. I know you were on
Yeah,
an episode earlier where we talked about children's books, if I
a
remember correctly.
long time ago. Yeah, that was really fun. And I've been a long time listener since then. So it's I'm very glad to be here today to talk about the science of math.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, if folks are interested in children's counting books, they can look back. I think it was episode 1509. But
Wow.
yeah, today, very different topic. We're talking about
Yeah.
science of mathematics overall. So I appreciate you coming to just share your perspective on the science of math efforts. And I know there's a lot of people involved in that, but
There
just
are.
really glad that
Yeah.
you're taking time to share your perspective. I want to start at the beginning about how did the science of math group get started?
Yeah, so you're asking specifically about a group around the science of math, and many people point to a website that's about the science of math. And so I kind of got this going back during the pandemic. So during that time, like probably many researchers, including yourself, I was doing a lot of school-based research before March of 2020. And then all of those programs came to an abrupt halt. And that was true for the 2020 to 21 school year. We were not in schools at all that year. And so I looked back into my notes, Sam, because I knew you were going to ask. And back in the fall of 2020, based on some conversations where people had started talking to me about, is there a science of math? I got a group of people together, knowing that most of us weren't as busy as we normally were. And I sent out a Zoom invite to about 20 people who I thought might be interested in a conversation around the science of math, which the group wasn't even called the science of math at that point. And we met for the first time in December of 2020. And I think a lot of those conversations started to come to me and come across my radar because there have been for the last 5, even 10 years, a lot of conversations around the science of reading. Even before the Sold a Story podcast came out 2022, there was a lot of chitter chatter and a lot of pamphlets and conference presentations and books called The Science of Reading. And so many people, knowing that I'm interested in mathematics, they would say, well, is there a science of math? And I would usually say, yeah, there is. Like to me, science, if we look up a definition of it, it's this systematic study of things that occur in our environment, and you collect data to understand whether those things are impactful or not. And so I would always be like, yeah, there's a science of math. We know quite a bit about how to support students in terms of the learning of math. Now, as you know, and maybe as some of your listeners know, I do a lot of research for kids who have difficulty with math. And I see that there's a lot of research in that area. And most of those kids, Sam, are in general education classrooms receiving 100% of their math instruction by general ed teachers, but we still need to provide targeted support to those students. And so I'd say the evidence base in that area is very strong. I think you would say the evidence base in math ed is very strong. And so to me, that's all that data is collected through science. And so I would say, yeah, there is a science of math. But back to this more formal group. So we met for the first time in December 2020, and then kind of met just every month after that for a few months and said, well, what are some of the things that we could do to help guide teachers and caregivers into understanding what is important for the teaching of mathematics and the learning of mathematics? And just many of those efforts were analogous to the conversations that were going out there about the science of reading. And so the idea came, wouldn't it be nice instead of us all individually sharing stuff around this idea of a science of math, we could put together a website. And again, a lot of us, and by this time there were probably 25, 30 people on many of these Zoom calls, a lot of us had a little bit more extra time than we had in any previous school year. And so we were able to put together some one pagers, do some webinars, start a website, design a logo. And so we did all of that, put it out there, and conversations started around that science of math very quickly. So it was kind of exciting to get an effort like that off the ground. But then starting in the 2021 to 22 school year, I was back to more business as usual. So we're in schools most days. I'm traveling a lot to work with teachers across the United States. And so I didn't have as much time on the science of math. And some people continued those efforts. And so still to this day, I don't think there's that much that's going on the website, but many of the science of math conversations had shifted to other avenues. Yeah.
And I'm curious if you could sort of crystallize what the goals were, because I know it sounds like this group kind
Yeah.
of came together, sort of organically started to
Yeah. Yeah.
find the moment. But toward what end did you kind of set out as the goal that was in front of you as a group?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, a lot of our initial conversations went around as the goal was to help teachers understand what would be some of the research validated practices that would be helpful in using in their classroom or maybe their tutoring group to help students with mathematics. And a goal that has always been of mine, and I think a lot of people who are core to the Science of Math group, was to help students who experience difficulty with math. And that is how I see also the science of reading played out. They were really focused on when students struggle with some of the core foundations related to reading, maybe that's phonics or maybe it's reading comprehension. What are some of the evidence-based practices, or what I would think about as research validated practices, that can be used to help teach reading to those kids? And so I've seen the parallel to math in the United States. We see, based on NAEP data, about 64% of grade 4 students don't meet a minimum level of math proficiency. In grade 8, that goes up to 74% of students. And so, to me, the interpretation I see of that data is that 2/3 to 3/4 of the students in the United States experience that some level of difficulty with mathematics. And so the science of math can help inform a lot of the conversations for what I would say are the majority of students in the United States related to what are the research validated practices we should be using to support those students. And this is a conversation we need to be having in general education spaces because the majority of these students receive all of their math instruction in general education math classrooms. And what are the ways that we can support those students? And often, when we're talking about these research validated practices that are important for students who experience that difficulty with mathematics, they're also important for students who don't experience that difficulty. So we do see that they may be important practices for all learners.
And I think too, my work is similar where I'm looking closely at teaching practice. I'm definitely just hoping for a general collective kind of improvement in mathematics teaching, but
Yeah,
that's not to take anything away from the math teachers who are doing the job. I mean, I
that's
love
right.
and I champion and I support the math teachers everywhere, and I've kind of come to saying like I'm thankful for every single math teacher because I'm
Oh,
just
yeah.
glad that they're there doing the work and the schools are needing
Yeah.
them
And
to,
working so hard and
yeah.
having such passion for the mathematics and for teaching and for the students that they're working with. Yeah, math
Yeah.
teachers are absolutely incredible. I agree.
Yeah. And so I very much want to provide support, do things that the teachers are appreciative of or that help
Yeah.
them make their life a little bit better. But also, we are inside a US culture of mathematics instruction that, as you're
Yeah.
pointing out, and I think most people would agree, the broad approach that we're taking to math teaching has not been as successful as we would want it to be. So, like,
Yeah.
I think there should be a kind of shared goal of
Hmm.
collectively, not pointing the finger at any individual, but just collectively, is there something that we could be doing better for our math instruction, sort of broadly across the country?
Agreed. And I think thinking about, well, what is the evidence? And this might lead into our next part of the conversation, but what is the evidence to support this program that maybe our school has invested in? Or maybe what is the evidence that supports this strategy that I'm using to teach materials from this program or just to teach in general? But I think all of that evidence needs to always come back to, it needs to be reflected that is this evidence leading to improved student outcomes in math. And that's where I really think a lot of the goals of the science of math are thinking about the evidence that is out there that is showing that this is an important thing to do when we want to help students become better mathematicians.
So, what came out of the group, and you mentioned the website,
Yeah,
thescienceofmath.com. So, that
yeah,
website originated, you mentioned webinars, you mentioned one pagers. You kind of put out this, as a team, developed these myth busting kind of like documents
yeah.
or
There's a
web
few
pages
things over there. Yep.
where it's kind of like there's an idea or there's a claim that's made about math teaching, and then you sort of unpack it, and sometimes you kind of challenge the conventional wisdom and sort of say, here's some.
Yes.
So you have that
Yeah.
whole set of things. But I wonder if you could just talk about the Science of Math group and how you approached those multiple avenues of communication. Was there kind of like a
Yeah.
strategic choice to like use web-based things, free things that you could share? There's
Yeah.
also been some journal articles that have had the Science of Math sort of like
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
title on them. But so
Yeah.
maybe just talk about how the group was thinking about the way they were going to communicate, the way they were going to try to spread the message.
Yeah, I think the idea was that the website would just be a helpful landing page so that people could find documents that might have been shared via social media so that I, Sarah Powell, wasn't just sharing these things on my social media, but they could always go back to the website and people could download those things. So that's where the website came in. It's just like this common place where things could be shared. Yeah, there was a person in the science and math group that led a special issue for a journal that's focused in special education. So that contributed to some articles around the science of math. But where I think it has really gone over the last few years beyond a website or beyond journal articles is to social media. And I think this is something that most people have no control over. But I checked this morning, there is a Science of Math Facebook group that currently has over 32,000 members. The conversations on there are very, let's see, very teacher focused. A lot of questions about programs, like which program should I use? Which program should I buy? A lot of questions about data collection and assessments, but it's almost all teachers, administrators. I see some caregivers on there just asking questions about what's best if I'm supporting this fifth grade student who has difficulty with math. And that is something that cannot be really, it's not controlled at all. It's just a space for people to come with questions and comments and feedback. And there's a lot of comments about evidence and things that have evidence and things that don't. And I would say, Sam, it's like the science of math is in so many places. I recently saw a book that had the science of math in the title of it. I do not know the authors of that book. I've never talked to them. And so I think that's where the science of math, while there is a website and there was a core group that got that started, I see the science of math as like a direct analog to the science of reading, in which the science of reading is not a thing. It's this movement. And I think I see the same thing for the science of math. Are people talking about research validated practices in math? Are those practices leading to improved outcomes for students? And anybody can engage in that conversation. And some of us just started that conversation maybe a little bit earlier than other people, but we're all engaged in the conversation, whether we think we are or not.
So you didn't trademark science of math.
No, there's no trademarking on it. Again, because it's a movement, it's a conversation starter. It isn't a thing that you can buy. I mean, I even spent a little bit of time yesterday in the preparation for this podcast. I was on some websites of some pretty popular math curriculum, and I see that they mention the science of math, right? So like the conversations are out there. And now it's thinking about, well, what is the evidence that exists to support what we're doing in the math classroom? Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you getting us started here in this episode and
Ugh,
providing your
yeah, you're welcome.
perspective.
Yeah.
Now, I appreciate also that you're saying there's other people involved and that you can only speak for yourself. These
Yes.
final questions for this
Yeah.
first part, I do want to just ask you to speak for yourself as Sarah Powell.
Okay. Will
What
do.
has been a highlight for you thus far in the science of math realm of things?
Well, just being able to have conversations with hundreds of people who are focused on how do we improve math instruction for students. I think that's a big one. I was in Australia in October and I was doing a teacher training down there. And a teacher at one of the breaks was like, "Oh, have you ever seen this website?" And shows me the Science of Math website. And I was like, "Yeah, I have." Yeah. And that is interesting. We get a lot of feedback internationally because there's a lot of conversations going on around the world about how do we improve the math outcomes for students. And a lot of teachers, I was in Michigan last week and in California like 2 weeks ago, and teachers will say stuff about the science of math just kind of like offhandedly. And I say nothing, and they do not know that I have been a part of getting all of that started. But it's just great that people are out there talking about like what is the science of math and is our school adhering to those research validated practices. So I would say for me, just kind of stumbling into the science of math in the wild and knowing that people are talking about it is a pretty incredible thing. That's a positive. There have also been some negatives, I will say, from me. I feel that there has been some backlash. Sometimes it feels personal to me. And, that's okay. Everyone is allowed to express their enthusiasm or their disdain for things. And one of the things that I've just thought about a lot lately is that a lot of people share a lot of ideas, but not everybody is able to do something with those ideas. And I've always thought of myself as a doer. I'm like, oh, let's just do this. And so I'm happy to be the person that steps up to the plate and kind of like, takes the first one for the team. But I will say, Sam, that sometimes my feelings have been hurt, but I always go back to the idea that I'm here to focus on teachers who teach mathematics, particularly when students have difficulty with mathematics. And I'm mostly here to make sure that all students have access to really good, high quality, research validated math instruction. And if a few people are going to make me feel crappy about that from time to time, I'm okay to take that from time to time. Yeah, so I'll say that there's a lot of positives, but there've been a few drawbacks.
Well, also spurring something that ends up with a Facebook group of 32,000 people, or spurring something that
It's
becomes a
crazy.
conversation point
Yeah,
for teachers and administrators and curriculum developers
yeah,
and researchers in special ed and researchers in math ed and beyond.
yeah.
having something that actually starts to become that much of a conversation piece, there's going to be opinions and perspectives
For
and
sure.
debates on
As
all
there
sides.
should. Yeah, if we didn't have those opinions and different experiences, if we already knew what was the best way to teach mathematics, we wouldn't be here having this conversation and we'd have 100% of students in the United States demonstrating math proficiency. So, I really doubt that people disagree that there's I'll say, quote unquote, like science to the teaching and learning math. Like, I think to me, science, as I said before, is like that collection of data through often like observations and experiments that can help you understand whether something is important to do. But I see that the real disagreement comes in the approaches to that science. And different science leads to different evidence. And so that's where a lot of the conversations are and should be of figuring out, what are the different types of evidence that have been created by these different avenues of science and which evidence should make it into the hands of teachers to improve the math learning of students.
Yeah, even if there are people who might disagree that there is like one most effective way of teaching
Y-
instruction, like they might disagree with that sort of thing.
yes.
But
Yeah.
I agree with you though that they shouldn't disagree with just the pursuit of careful data collection and
Great.
analysis and
Yeah,
interpretation of what are we seeing in that data, even if it
exactly.
doesn't always point towards one quote unquote proven like way of teaching mathematics or something like that. Even if you sort of want to disrupt the positivism of that sort of frame, I think
Hmm.
still we hopefully could at least agree, like, but wouldn't you want more data? Wouldn't you want to look
Yeah.
carefully at the evidence for whatever it is that you're doing or whatever you're trying or whatever you might try? It seems like it would be good to have evidence about how that has gone or how it could go.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is also time and place. I already said here on this podcast, like I'm really focused on students who experience difficulty with mathematics, which the data shows is the majority of kids in the United States. So for me, like let's focus on what might be helpful for the majority of kids in the United States. Is that every single learner every single day? No. And so it is like, well, what there might be other practices, other research validated practices that would be important for those students. But just as the science of reading always comes back to this idea that there are students who struggle with learning how to read, and we know a lot about how to support those students, I would suggest that the science of math is like we have a lot of students who struggle with the learning of math, and we know a lot about how to support those students. And, when and how should we support those learners? That's where my brain always goes with the science of math. But we should probably expand it to think about like all learners, and maybe that could be a conversation for next time.
My next guest is Rachel Lambert, who's a professor in special education and math education at the Gewurz Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Rachel, thanks so much for being here with me.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for asking me to be on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate that you have the special ed and the math ed background as kind of a border crosser in these spaces. And I also know that you've been very thoughtful and have engaged with the science of math efforts, looked at them closely, done some analysis. So I'm very happy to have your perspectives in this conversation. What we're going to do now is we are going to basically talk about some of the things we've noticed about science of math, raise some concerns, also ask some questions, and just share some of our thoughts as we've reacted to the science of math effort. So first of all, we both wanted to share that there are some things that we agree with and that we support about the science of math effort. It's not all bad. Like for example, you might have been able to tell in my conversation with Sarah that I do appreciate innovative efforts and people making attempts to try to bring research to the land of practice, try to condense research into a shareable form, and also trying to answer some of the questions that people in practice might have. So just making that sort of effort, which I view the science of math as like one effort to try to do that, I applaud that sort of attempt, and I can't really fault somebody for trying to bridge the research gap to the practice gap as something to strive for.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the issues with mathematics education, with special education, is the disconnect with practitioners. Practitioners in mathematics, in whether they're special educators or general educators, are hungry to learn more about what's going to work with their students, about what works for what purposes, when, what kind of mathematical growth they're looking for in their students. And so the idea of making that more shareable and more usable and connecting to teachers where they are, I think is wonderful. And I aim to do that in my own work. So I respect any effort to connect with teachers.
Yeah, and we can't deny that there was some interest and some uptake. They've had thousands of people join a Facebook group in this realm. People have shared, materials from the science of math. So to me, that also points to there is a demand for this sort of thing. Now we could talk more, and we will talk more about what is being supplied to meet that demand, and we have some questions and concerns about that. But another thing that I know you and I both kind of agree is we also like that at least there's a purported attempt to use evidence as a backing for the answers or the things that are being shared. That desire for evidence and trying to supply evidence is, I think, a good intention. We'll talk more about the evidence that's used, but that's something that we can kind of credit them for as well.
Yeah, on the first page, I think, of the Science of Math website, if it's still there, there was some language about research, and it talked about the importance of using evidence to support claims about student learning. And it mentions multiple kinds of research evidence. So quantitative evidence, randomized controlled trials, but also qualitative evidence and correlational evidence, because as we know that if we're making we have different kinds of questions about student learning and teacher learning, we have to use different kinds of methodologies. So I respect that idea that we're going to use whatever kinds of methodologies are going to work with the kinds of questions we have about teaching and learning.
Yeah, and now we do have some critiques and some concerns about both of these things. Like, first of all, the communication to practice, we have some concerns about the definitiveness or how strongly some of the answers are given, the terms with which the answers are given. And we also have some concerns about the kind of evidence that's used. So maybe we can dig into both of those things a little bit.
So another thing that I've noticed on the website is that there are a bunch of handouts for teachers. And on those handouts for teachers, it talks about misconceptions or myths about teaching and learning in mathematics. And then it presents the truth, 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 like 100% here is the truth. I am suspicious of any person, any politician, anybody who starts telling us that they're going to give us the one truth about something, and especially in educational research. Because as I tell my students all the time, like, tell me an idea you have about teaching and learning, and I can find you at least one study to support what you're saying. But can I find multiple studies? There are so many things about mathematical teaching and learning where we have conflicting evidence across different kinds of studies that use different methodologies, that have different theories of learning. And to act like that doesn't exist is extremely strange on a website that begins by telling us it's going to care about all kinds of evidence. To say truth that is one finding, for example, that inquiry-based teaching doesn't support learning, when there are studies that definitely support that, and hundreds of them. But there's also hundreds of them that say explicit instruction also works. So it's disingenuous to say that one way or the other way is what works all the time for all kinds of math learning in all kinds of situations with all kinds of learners. I don't trust when I'm told that the truth is one thing and one thing only when we're talking about educational research.
Yeah, I have also gotten that impression from the website and from other things that have been written, under the Science of Math moniker. And I know Sarah was talking about how some people have used the Science of Math moniker and they're doing so rogue or independently or whatever. But for me, one of the things I've noticed is I do feel like there's this tone of supreme confidence that it's like I'm here to set the record straight or I'm here to provide the evidence. Like so kind of what you're saying, and I've seen it in other kinds of language use as well, that it seems to have this really strong tone. And to me, that kind of conflicts with the framing of science of math. Like for me, when I think of science, I always think of hedges and putting appropriate qualifiers on any claims, and sort of everything is always held lightly because it might, you might get new evidence in the future that starts to shed a different light on it. So for me, like when I think about science, I think about tentativeness and careful phrasing of claims. And so for this one to have the science of math being, it almost plays into the public perception of science, which is that science has the answers. But when you're actually doing science, and to me, how I understand the scientific practice is you're actually always trying to disprove yourself and you're always trying to check your biases and you're always trying to like have somebody else look at your data to make sure you're not inferring something that's not there. And so for me, science is more tentative and cautious in its phrasings. but the public thinks of science as like the answer. And so it almost to me is playing into the public side of it. So maybe this is part of the challenge of communicating to the public, that you fall into like the public perceptions of science as like having the answers or claiming to have the answers.
Yes, and I see on the website, for example, different times, different claims are described in this very like bold, we know all the answers way, and then other times in much more measured tones. So for example, there's these claims that inquiry-based instruction doesn't ever work, or that explicit instruction promotes creativity. But then elsewhere on the website, there is a sentence, and I'm not going to say it exactly, but it's something similar to, there is a lot of evidence that explicit instruction can be effective for students who are having difficulty with mathematics.
Mm.
But it also might be helpful for all students. So that's a careful claim. And there is also a lot of research on explicit instruction for students with disabilities. That is the research that exists. So saying there's a strong body of research is very measured. But what I'm picking up on is what I'm talking about is that I even hear different tones within the website or the other materials where there seems to be some people who play fast and loose with the claims. And then there's other writers who are like careful and measured. And so that's a little confusing as a reader.
Mm.
As an expert, that's confusing to me. So what I really worry about is how confusing that is to teachers who are being told that there is this truth and then on another part of the website, it's a little more complicated than that. I think that's hard for teachers to understand.
Well, I need to just give you credit for even being careful and cautious in how we phrased this conversation point, because I was kind of painting with a broad brush, and you're like, well, there are times where they're more measured and they hedge it appropriately. So,
Yeah.
so you're even being measured and hedging in, how we're talking about our critiques here. So I appreciate that. But right underneath that too is the evidence that they point to. So they do try to have citations for many of their claims. And this is a critique that I know you and I have talked about, and I've heard from a lot of other people as well, is there's a feeling that the citations that are given are from a certain literature base, not looking broadly at all of the kinds of evidence that we might have from math education broadly. And again, just to speak personally, to me, sometimes it seems like they're citing things that whoever wrote the page is familiar with, but I don't always get a sense that they systematically kind of looked across a lot of different studies. I don't know, what are your thoughts? I know you've looked and you've had teams that have looked at some of the citations. What do you see there in the evidence that they use?
Well, I've looked at the citations. It started about 2 years ago when I saw the Science of Math webpage, and I was really interested in it. Just to take a step back and tell you why I'm here talking about that and why this matters to me is that I was a special educator for more than 10 years, and my favorite thing to teach was mathematics. And I went into my doctoral program because I felt like the literature on special ed in mathematics didn't describe the sort of students that I knew, the students with disabilities that I was related to, the people that I know with dyslexia who may or may not be mathematicians themselves. There was a real deficit focus to the literature. It was almost completely about explicit instruction, and there was a disdain or a dislike or a distrust of constructivism and what they called discovery learning. So that's why I became a researcher, because of my passion for making sure that research better matched the potential and the strengths of people with disabilities and gave access to all kinds of mathematics, not just one kind of learning. So because of that, I have been studying special education mathematics literature for over 10 years. So I've done multiple studies where I've read in like a 5-year period. I did a study Paulo Tan and I did a study where we looked at 5 years of research in math education that included disabilities or didn't. We compared that with research in special education. So I can say pretty strongly that I have read all of this literature in special education, and I'm really familiar with its ideological and pedagogical sort of assumptions about learning. So the evidence that supports the claims that are being made is typically from special education or educational psychology literature and mathematics, as are the people who have created the website. They're also in special education and educational psychology. And so there is a very limited sphere. There's like one field. There's good research from that one field, but that's not what I would consider a science of math. If you ask the average teacher, if you tell them that you're going to talk to them about the science of math, they're going to make assumptions that you're talking about an interdisciplinary field. They're going to make assumptions that you're talking about research that exists in mathematics education. And the fact that that research is either omitted or not understood or somehow discounted or discredited, even though math ed research has all kinds of methodologies and all kinds of findings and is a very large body of research, then I think that's really misleading because you're not telling those teachers that you're talking from a very specific vantage point. You're talking from a vantage point in special education that has historically been behavioral, that has historically been really focused on direct instruction and then explicit instruction. So most of the research on kids with disabilities in math is about explicit instruction and direct instruction. And so the findings on learning are about explicit instruction and direct instruction. And there is very little research that is funded at the scale it needs to be done with students with special education that investigates any other kinds of ways of teaching or learning. So this is a narrow field and a field that has very specific ideas of what counts as good evidence. And the perspective of the science of math coming from that perspective is problematic, not because they're not great researchers about what they do, and not because it shouldn't be about students with disabilities, but because that's a really, really small space. Somebody described it on Twitter as they're doing a really good job describing one room in a house, but they've forgotten all the other rooms in the house.
Yeah. That's a good point you made, though, about the funding and how that fits into, because within special ed or within educational psychology, there is a leaning towards certain methodologies or study designs, like randomized controlled trials, that you can really have sort of quasi-experimental or experimental kinds of designs. And then if you're in that world, you start to see studies that had those designs. You might start to take their conclusions as fairly firmly in place. But then if you start to look at like, oh, well, what other RCTs, randomized controlled trials or A/B tests or experimental designs maybe would test the opposing view or another alternative. And then you realize, oh, the funding agencies don't fund those ones. So they don't exist. It's like it could be falsified, but it's not falsified because the funding agency is also funding the RCTs, or it is also funding the quasi-experimental or the experimental designs to get a large enough scale. And so it's basically like, I think at that point you should be like, okay, I have some evidence of something, but I'm still going to hold it somewhat tentatively because there is not the opportunity to do the falsification. There isn't the opportunity to do a large test of something, a different approach to instruction at the same quote unquote methodological rigor, because the funding agencies are in the same fields as the folks that are doing those first studies, or used to be when we still had federal funding.
I know. I do want to say that I support all research being done and being funded at this point. Many flowers need to bloom for good research to be done. I think I have a lot of strong questions about why there has not been inquiry-based instruction funded by the IES. I know that there has been strong inquiry-based work, Brian Botke and other colleagues but since then, I haven't seen funding in this area, and I don't know whether they're not receiving applications or that this kind of work is not being funded. So it's also important just to mention for any listener who's thinking about what I just said about special education is that in large reports that sum up all of this research, it's been repeated multiple times that there is no evidence that inquiry-based instruction doesn't work for students with disabilities or students who need more support in mathematics. They note that the research doesn't exist, so that we shouldn't then assume that the research that we have is all that exists. And that would be a massive violation of students' sort of rights to have different kinds of math instruction, to be exposed to different ways of thinking. So it's really important to remember that just because a lot of research exists, that research is one way of teaching for one group of kids, doesn't mean that other things don't work for those students, because we don't have the evidence that it doesn't.
And Sarah did mention science of reading, being one of the sort of inspirations for science of math. But I know that there are some differences in how the science of reading, kind of came together versus the science of math group. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, the science of reading is a really old term. It's been around for a long time. And the science of reading defines itself, as much as it is a unitary idea, as being extremely interdisciplinary. So neuroscience, cognitive science, educational studies, special education is a part of the science of reading, but it is not the only field. So to me, the biggest difference between these two is that one is 60 years. That's how long the science of reading has been developing and co-developing as an interdisciplinary field with lots and lots of research and different parts of research that are talking to each other. And the science of math, as it is currently exists, is a website that is connected to some articles and some discussions of a group of people that are all in fundamentally one academic field. So it is not that the fact that they are in special education that is a problem for me because I am a special educator. It is the fact that they are just in one field. And for anything to be a science of any subject, it needs to be like rigorously interdisciplinary to understand learning at multiple levels with different kinds of evidence-based research practices.
Yeah, and to connect with the ideas about science in general, what I would love is like if science of math was like a place where you bring your evidence, I'll bring my evidence. We'll actually just look, make sure we understand the evidence, and we sort of hash out when they maybe are showing different things. There's some way to make sense of that, rather than it being sort of a one group putting their evidence forward and then kind of brushing away other sorts of evidence.
Yeah, because that's science, like you said.
Yeah, and I know we want to talk about some straw man, straw person kinds of arguments or claims that can be put up, and sometimes it feels like the math education side is getting straw personed out, like a weak version or an inaccurate version of what math education is actually working on is put forth. And this will come up in some of the misconceptions because, as you mentioned, the website will have myths or misconceptions about math ed. And they'll kind of say something that's maybe a phrasing that's out in the world, and then they'll try to provide some evidence and try to provide the, like you said, the true version of it. Part of these are related to inquiry-based instruction or guided inquiry kind of instruction or discovery-based learning. And this is one that's often, I think, like a straw person kind of thing, where the discovery-based learning that folks from science of math or folks who critique math ed, what they have in mind is something that's very just loose and the kids are all over the place and it's wandering all over and where is it going? And it seems like an unproductive use of time. And then some students might get an insight, but others don't. But it seems like not a fair representation of what you and I might have in mind when we think about something like guiding inquiry. So I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, so one of the citations that I looked at in depth was there's a page for teachers, and the page for teachers used to be exactly the same on the website as like a page on the website, but now it's changed a little bit. But this exact same page is still available for teachers on inquiry-based instruction. And it talks about myths about inquiry-based instruction. And then there are, I think, 5 citations on the page. And I looked at those in depth. And I did this also a webinar for NCTM where this was part of a larger argument where I discuss, it's not all about the science of math, that webinar, but I happened to touch on it in part of the webinar about understanding evidence-based claims in research. So those 5 citations about inquiry-based math, the first one was a study by Alfieri and colleagues from 2011, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with because I remember reading it a long time ago. And basically, I explain this to teachers pretty frequently. It's 2 sets of studies. And the first set of studies they're looking at, it's a meta-analysis of a lot of studies that appear to be done in different like psychological labs over time. Not all of them, but that's what it appears like to me. And the first study compares explicit instructional practices to basically like free form discovery learning. I mean, I think they define it as problems are given to kids and then there's like no support. So it's like you give a problem and you leave the room. Yeah. And they found, and I always ask teachers, predict which one is more effective for math learning. And they're all like, obviously, being explicit with kids is better than doing no teaching at all. And then the second study changes those instructional conditions a little bit and makes it a lot more like what we ask teachers to do and how we taught math when we taught math, which is a guided inquiry approach. So now there's scaffolding, now there's questioning. It's not even a highly guided approach in this study. It's just that there is guidance, there is discussion, there is some metacognition. Kids are talking and discussing and explaining their thinking. They then compared that to explicit instructional conditions, which was just changed slightly. And then the more effective practice in this particular study was the more guided inquiry practice. So I explained that in a little detail just because that was put as the first citation. Well, it's alphabetically first, but it's used a lot, but it was used to support that inquiry-based instruction doesn't work. And that really confuses me because, as I said, there's two different studies there. So it makes me think that anybody would use that as a citation and say, see, this shows that inquiry-based instruction doesn't work, doesn't think that guided inquiry is what we're doing.
Yeah.
They think it's discovery-based.
I think it's the first one. They think it's the free-for-all. Yeah.
I didn't even learn what discovery learning was until I was a doc student. Like I didn't hear it in my work as a teacher, even as a special education math teacher. And when someone explained to me what they thought it was, I couldn't believe it. Because I was like, wait, but if you're teaching mathematics, you're using questioning, you're using scaffolds. Like I'm using like visuals. It's super purposeful. I have there's so much structure in the way I do inquiry-based instruction. I was so confused by what they meant by discovery-based learning, but I found subsequently that there are people, especially some researchers in the special education world, who really believe that discovery-based instruction exists, is happening everywhere, and the children are being given problems and then given no help at all, which is shocking to me.
Yeah. And I'm glad you went into that in depth too, because that's even a little bit different than our earlier point. Like our earlier point was that there might be important evidence that is being left off of the Science of Math lit reviews or the Science of Math reference lists. This one is one that's on the Science of Math reference list, but as you pointed out, is kind of being misused, and a certain little part of it is being put forward as therefore discovery or inquiry doesn't work at all. So that's even a study that made it to their citation list is kind of a little bit problematic in how it's being thrown around.
And there's more around guided inquiry that are used. There's a Lysander study around the importance of guidance and inquiry, which is a more recent meta-analysis than that other one. And it's basically saying, yeah, guidance is super important when we're doing inquiry-based work. The way it's cited on the webpage now makes me feel like some people seem to think that any guidance makes it not inquiry. I don't know how to explain this exactly, but the idea that, I don't know, I was reading some constructivist the other day, and she said, all good instruction has structure. All good teaching has structure. And I love that quote because just because I ask kids to think about things, to experiment with things, to explore with things, doesn't mean that there isn't structure.
Right.
And sometimes I see people, some of the researchers associated with the science of math, if you talk about structure and instruction, they then assume you're talking about explicit instruction. But I'm not talking about explicit instruction because I'm not telling them first how to think. Structure is a part of all good ways of teaching. Fundamentally, explicit instruction, its structure is important to how it's successful. Inquiry-based or guided inquiry, structure is important to why it's successful. Kids, we have to structure our instruction, sequence it purposely. All these things, these are critical.
Yeah. In fact, you need a really good structure that you've really thought about because that's kind of what you're going to hang your hat on. Like you're not going to have the teacher leading it the whole way through, so you have to have that good structure in place so that it goes productively.
Yes, you need more structure, but a different kind of structure because it's not, yeah.
Yeah. Another one of their listed misconceptions that kind of didn't sit right with me, I'm not exactly sure why, but maybe you can kind of talk it out, is the one that's about algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
It felt a little bit like they were saying that the math ed side is against algorithms or something. Let me read it to make sure I'm getting this right. So they shared a truth of, capital T truth, an algorithm is a step-by-step procedure for solving a problem and is generally the most reliable and efficient way to solve a problem. So I don't know that that's a capital T truth.
Yeah.
An algorithm is a way to solve a problem, but it's not always, not even most of the time, the most reliable and efficient. I mean, first of all, you're having a human do it, and humans are not always the most reliable, not the most efficient. Oftentimes, number sense is more efficient than an algorithm. Technology, using a calculator, using a computer, is often way more efficient than the algorithm, assuming this is like an algorithm that somebody would do with paper and pencil. So that one, to me, is kind of lifting algorithms up higher than they need to be, although I'm not against algorithms. And they do talk about how algorithm is, it requires conceptual understanding and procedural knowledge. I actually disagree with their truth there. I don't think an algorithm requires conceptual understanding. I think students can complete an algorithm without having the conceptual understanding. They can just make it through the procedure successfully. And I actually think we have quite a bit of evidence of that, of documented cases of students that performed an algorithm, but then upon probing and upon further investigation, didn't really know the mathematics, didn't know what was happening, what it meant.
Yes, just because they can crank through it doesn't mean that they have a conceptual understanding of mathematics. So another one of the common misconceptions that they list that I find problematic is the idea that they list as a misconception. Productive struggle causes more robust understanding and learning. They say the misconception is that struggling or grappling with challenging math tasks causes students to gain a deeper understanding. I think there is a lot of research that supports that kids understand when they think about something. I mean, whether we call it struggle or not, we could call it productive failure, we could call it struggle, but that problem solving itself, which is inherently done without being told exactly how to solve it, creates deeper learning. I think there is a ton of evidence that supports that. And on that same page, they say the truth is that productive struggle does not deepen understanding or problem solving. Instead, they say it can lead to frustration and cause students to develop misconceptions. And the two citations that they give for that, well, one of them is a Brown and Campione article from 1994, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Campione. But it's a study of communities of learners. It's like a sociocultural study. It's like a classic about how kids think with demanding lessons and think in a community of practice. And in one part of that article, I found like a paragraph where they said kids started developing a misconception. I think it was about a science concept. And they cited that the whole paper is about how this kind of engagement and problem solving is supportive of student learning. That's the whole paper. And then there's one part that said kids had a misunderstanding during the process and then worked through it. And they're citing that to say that it causes frustration and causes failure. So this is like, that is a kind of citation mispractice that I really dislike, because they're citing somebody who have worked their whole career to show and work through and really systematically understand how kids learn in communities of practice and how kids learn through problem solving, and saying that it causes frustration, so we shouldn't do it. The evidence that's presented is not strong, and yet it is labeled as truth. That's very problematic for me, because once again, this is going to teachers. This is being offered to teachers as truth. And I think that that's very problematic. If your goal is to bring research to the masses, you need to bring that same open and like that same kind of questioning. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's what feels strong. Here's what doesn't feel strong. Not the wrong, right, black and white approach that they're giving.
Yeah. And I know Sarah was talking about how the science of math has taken off, and it's not always sanctioned by the original group. But this one, like you're talking about, is on the website itself. And so then there's kind of that question of, hey, who's monitoring the website? If we find out that this citation has not been used appropriately, and again, we're just offering this up as, hey, this is what we're seeing when we look at the citation and mapping it to the claim that's being made. To me, that's a very fair kind of critique. It also is something that maybe could be revised or updated on the website, since that's actually at the Science of Math, page.
Yeah.
It's not something that's just spread in social media or somebody else taking it and running it off on a wild direction.
Yeah, correct. So if it's on the web, I mean, I would like to see people take the Science of Math webpage and do a more scientific job of assessing those citations and making sure they're correct, because of the intent of the webpage. I wouldn't be this strict about every webpage, but the webpage just says they're going to take evidence and present it fairly to teachers. So I think we can have really high expectations of their citation practices. I mean, there was a claim on one of the inquiry-based page, there was a claim that explicit instruction increases creativity in learners. And then the only citation I could find was a paper about undergraduate economics learning critical thinking by being told with some explicit instruction. Teachers don't look at citations, and they expect, and they are right to expect, that at least your citation is going to be a good faith effort to support the idea that you're doing, that you're trying to put forward. So I think that there should be some more attention to that. And I will say that is also true of a lot of math ed researchers.
Yeah. Yep.
As I've gotten deeper into this work with the science of math and thinking about these citations, like I've thought, okay, maybe that citation I did in that paper, like I wish I had looked deeper. I wish I had done better. I am not perfect with my citations, but now I try to be. So I've actually really kind of learned and grown through this experience of thinking about this website, because I'm like, could anybody think that this is a misuse of a citation? Do I feel like I'm really actually thinking about the spirit in which this paper was written? How am I misconstruing it? And what's the quality of the data here?
Yeah, I would hope to kind of challenge math ed things in the same way that we're challenging some of these science of math citations. I've done some citation analysis of Stein and Lane and systematically looked through how it was cited and what claims people were making to cite it. It was kind of eye-opening to look at math ed and how we're citing things. Even a very recent Jeremy commentary, I was reading it. I was a little bit, wondering about certain points. So I did go ahead and check a couple of the citations, and they were fairly weak, in my opinion, from like the claim that was being made from them. I might do an episode on this later if I can. But also in Science of Math, they're putting science in their name. So for me, this is a little bit of like we talked about earlier, I'm supportive of the effort to bridge research to practice. But I also think it could be an opportunity to raise our game. Like, hey, if we're going to be the science of math, maybe this is a chance to really try to get our best citations. And let's try to be like as careful as we can about what we put in bold font or what we, state as a true finding to the best of our knowledge about math education. So for me, it's almost maybe it's like an opportunity we can even do better than math ed has done in the past, and also maybe doing better than what Science of Math has like put forward in their first attempts. And I should say, by the way, there are a couple of their misconceptions that I think have somewhat of a point. Like they have one about conceptual and procedural understanding, and they say that it's a misconception to think that conceptual has to be first and then procedural comes after that. So they're kind of saying that like the MCTM crowd or the math ed crowd is saying conceptual has to be first, then procedural. They call that a misconception, and then they sort of talk about them being linked. I think they kind of have a point there. I think sometimes we're too dogmatic that the conceptual has to be first and then the procedural, and I think it's more like a complex intertwining web that's happening.
I definitely agree. I think, though, that where this issue gets tricky, I 100% agree that there is enough evidence to show us that procedural and conceptual co-develop. But the evidence that they're citing, the article that they're citing, was a specific study that designed itself in a very specific way so both would develop. So it wasn't a kid learning an algorithm through explicit instruction. It was a series of like working on equations and thinking about a series of problems that were really connected in very purposeful ways. So while the kids were working through the procedural problems, the sequence was very much designed for kids to think about the concepts, like a number string, which is a teaching practice that I've done for a long time. You sequence your problems that you're doing with students in a particular way because it helps them think about big ideas, big concepts, right? So the sequence, you can give a series of raw number problems and conceptual understanding can develop. So that's what the research was about. And now I'm seeing that research cited to support the idea that you can just teach procedural first and conceptual will naturally come. And I would like to see evidence for that claim. So I'd like to see evidence that teaching just procedures will result in conceptual understanding. And the reason I would love to see more evidence on that is that in general, special education, mathematics in special education doesn't assess conceptual understanding. So there are very few studies I can think of in the field that I would say assess conceptual understanding in a way that would be recognizable, or even assess it at all, or even say they're assessing conceptual understanding. So I want to make sure that when we talk about the two things co-developing, you got to plan for that. And then you need to assess it so that we can see that the conceptual understanding has grown.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. And for me, I would retreat from a strong claim either way. I have seen in some NCTM stuff a strong claim that the conceptual is first and then the procedure will come out of that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I don't think you should say it that strongly. That's one way to go, but it's not like the only exclusive way to do it. And I would also retreat from somebody that tried to frame it the other way. It said like, work on the procedures first, then the conceptual will happen later. I would also be like, well, yeah, but you got to structure, like, again, back to the structure, you got to structure the experiences that build it. You have to bring it out. And also, I think you can do it where it's like a complex mix of the two together. And if you have a room of 20 students, it might be crossing either way for different students at different times.
Yeah.
But I do think it's fair to sometimes point out that math ed might sometimes be a little too strong in putting the conceptual first, as if that's like what has to happen.
I agree with what you're saying. I really do. I agree that it's not about assuming that either way it's going to work in the sequence in the way that you're imagining it. I think math ed has overemphasized the conceptual first so that teachers sometimes don't do the procedural work that they probably should that can co-develop with it. So yeah, I agree. Definitely agree. I would just like the claims to be a little less strong and then the evidence there to back up the claims, whichever they are.
Now, you were also talking about, conceptual and procedural together. This is one thing that you pointed out that you like about Science of Math, having the strands of proficiency, and that Science of Math does talk about the importance of all 5 of those strands.
I agree. I love the 5 strands of proficiency from the Adding It Up report, and I love that they centered those in the Science of Math website because this really connects to what we were just talking about the importance of both procedural understanding and conceptual understanding. Because those 5 different strands are conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, although that this definition of procedural fluency also includes picking different strategies that work for different situations. It's not just doing algorithms, although algorithms would be part of procedural fluency for sure. Strategic competence, which I kind of think of as problem solving, adaptive reasoning, which is thinking about justification and doing different kinds of reasoning to solve problems. And then last, productive disposition. So the idea that you see math as something useful and worthwhile, and you have the motivation and the self-efficacy to like keep trying it. Those 5 are all important and they're all intertwined. My question for the Science of Math folks would be, I don't see evidence on your website for any one but one of those strands. And even in that one strand, it's incomplete. The research that you're citing really focuses on procedural fluency and sort of just part of procedural fluency. So it's focused on algorithms, memorization of facts. It's really focused on being able to replicate procedures and not like flexible use of different strategies, which is also part of that strand. But I don't see an emphasis on conceptual understanding. I mean, it's mentioned, but I don't see a lot of really rigorous work which assesses conceptual understanding, with exceptions in special education. There's some people doing really cool work on that. And then strategic competence. So there's work on problem solving that goes on, which schema-based problem solving in special education. So that is related to the ability to solve problems, but I don't really see much of that actually on the webpage. And the idea of reasoning and justification talk, I don't see any evidence that the students using these methods are improving this area or learning and growing. And productive disposition. I think in math education more broadly, or we have a lot of evidence that inquiry-based instruction can support these non-academic outcomes. So it can support an increased sense of self-efficacy, it can create more motivated students, can help students like want to persevere in mathematics. But I don't see that same body of literature around their claims around explicit instruction. So yeah, my question is, let's work on the evidence base of all of these things. If that's what matters, then we should measure all of the things that matter.
Yeah, this is also a critique I've heard from several people about where's the joy in mathematics, or where is just some of that like diving in, having some fun with mathematical thinking, communicating to somebody else, and then just having a good time with mathematical ideas. They would kind of say, even if all of this science of math stuff was true, it seems like it's all directed towards the students successfully passing some sort of achievement test or something. Like they will follow science of math and they will successfully meet the fourth grade standards and the sixth grade standards and the eighth grade. But there's still this question of, are they forming a positive relationship with mathematics? Are they wanting to continue mathematically? Are they viewing it as a positive part of their identity? That would still very much be in question because it might be like, okay, you're drilling it into them, you're doing some effective, quote unquote, effective teaching things that are getting them to successfully do these procedures, but maybe 80% of the students are hating it and want to get out of it as soon as they can, you know. So that's another critique, and it to me it's just a question. It's like, hey, are you considering the joy? Are you considering the productive disposition? Some of these other outcomes? Maybe their answer will be like not important. That's maybe they'll say that's not what we're focusing on. We're only focusing on this. But I think that needs to be shared because if a teachers or schools or people are viewing this as like the answer for math teaching, those people might actually care about the motivation, the joy, the identity development, the inclusion of other things. So
yeah, as a teacher, I know that I cared a lot about that. I think that's one of the most important issues that we're dealing with right now in schools. And so I would like to see them address that because I think we have kids who feel disconnected to school, disconnected to mathematics. They feel uninspired and they are more resistant to doing really, really boring tasks like worksheets than they ever used to be. So the considering where students are, I talk about this also because I'm doing a research study on math games for intervention, like non-digital math games, and we're seeing such a like a visceral response from the children and the teachers. where their kids are behind, but what they want right now is ways for kids to be learning and be working on unfinished learning and working on skills, but also doing it in a way the kids will enjoy and will keep doing and will be excited about. It really matters a ton to teachers and kids in schools that math can be at least somewhat joyful, can be like engaging, can keep the kids working. Where their heads are not going down on the desks and they are just disengaging from what they're doing. Because the way kids are right now, the way kids are feeling, they need more stimulating, engaging, and meaningful mathematics. They don't need it to be less stimulating, engaging, and meaningful.
Mhm. Well, Rachel, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your perspectives and to talk through some of this with me. I do want to bring up one final thing, and then I promise I'll let you go. It's just, I wonder about how different groups who care about math education, how we diagnose the current situation, like at least in the United States. So NAEP comes out, Nation's report card comes out, underwhelming math scores. Oh, it seems like we're going in the wrong direction. In general, it seems like as a country, we're not that thrilled with how math teaching and math learning is going in the country. And when I talked to Sarah before, she kind of agreed, like, yeah, there seems to be a problem. We need to try to find some ways to improve the situation for math teaching. I'm just thinking broadly across the country. But I wonder if we really diagnose the issue very differently. So in science of math, I think that at least some of those folks are viewing it as like the NCTM reform math, quote unquote, discovery learning. We talked about like what they might mean by that. But I feel like some of them might think NCTM has been dominant for 30 or 40 years, and that is the reason for our stagnant or our decreasing math scores. I view it very differently. I'm curious to your thoughts. I view it very much as like the reform has never taken hold very much. The NCTM vision of math instruction, I've now had several years of, big teams of people. We've been just analyzing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of middle school and high school math lessons from across, I don't know, like 8 or 9 states. Like we observe a lot of math teaching from anywhere that we can find it. And we are not seeing the NCTM inquiry oriented, high cognitive demand tasks, discussion based learning. We are not seeing that at all. Like it actually like rounds to 0%. We're seeing like 94% low cognitive demand tasks. We're seeing every single lesson is teacher led discourse. Every single lesson is I speak, you listen, you receive the information. There's not like discussion based stuff. Like so for me, my diagnosis of it is NCTM and these reform efforts have not really succeeded in getting into schools. And that's how I sort of explain the lagging sort of student scores. But I feel like the science of math is like this NCTM stuff or this math ed stuff is all fuzzy math or it's all up in the clouds and it's not working. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, if there's anything to this possible separate diagnoses of what's going on.
Somebody recently said that like low test scores are a Rorschach test.
Yeah.
Like, so you look at low math, like we could do an interesting study on this. We could show it to different groups of people, these low math scores, and it could be like, well, what should we do? And it depends on how you diagnose the problem. I think that assuming that it's inquiry-based instruction is just a vibes call. It's like they think that it's happening everywhere. And because a lot of college professors talk about inquiry-based mathematics, they're just assuming that that's the problem. But all the empirical evidence I've seen, and you just brought some up, but I've been looking for empirical evidence and I've been finding some studies that they look at, like Heather Hill does really interesting work around this. And they're finding, unless there's a specific new curriculum that's being used that's more inquiry based, which one study had, the rest of these studies that I found are showing a decided lack of discussion, open-ended problem solving in US classrooms. And that was certainly true like back in the day when we had the 1996 the teaching gap, right? So that also looked at classrooms and found that same kind of instruction. So I don't think instruction has changed a lot. And I believe that based on empirical findings, not my assumption about what is happening in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I would love to see like empirical data about how that really documented that these low test scores are because there's too much discussion in schools.
Or group work. Another thing that we've looked at in our 500 something lessons is we look for group work. Most lessons do not have any group work at all. In total, there is like 10 or 11% of class time is spent on group work, but that's actually only in like 1/5 of lessons that even have group work at all. It's like 4/5 don't have group work. It's like, they have a teacher-led kind of thing. They have independent student work. So yeah, I also could imagine somebody saying, all this group work cooperative learning stuff has ruined our test scores. And I'm like, we're looking across 9 states and, 50 different classrooms and can't find it at all or barely find it. So yeah, I think that might be something there. Now, in math ed, we do report on things, but often it's like a scholar or a research team that has a school.
Yeah.
They work with one group of teachers and they maybe bring something to life. Like they might bring to life over a few years some cooperative learning or some discussion-based things. And I've been part of that too, like about working with teachers over a few years to try to get discussions happening, like mathematical discussions. But those are usually like a pocket. It's usually like that school that was working with that project. It's not like it took the nation by storm.
Yes, and I think that that is a really valid critique of inquiry-based instruction and a really big question we need to be addressing. And I think your work is addressing that, like thinking about why it hasn't taken off, why it isn't being used in more classrooms. What could we do to help teachers really like take this on under their current working conditions and grow as teachers? So we need to be talking about that in math education. We shouldn't ignore the reality. The one other thing to mention is the Gates Foundation did a survey recently of teachers and parents around math, and the diagnosis across that study was that math classrooms were not joyful enough places, according to the parents.
Mm-hmm.
They were too rote, too repetitive, too focused on procedures. And what parents wanted to see was kids more engaged. They wanted math to be more relevant, and they wanted more joy in the math class. So parents are an important stakeholder in these discussions. And the fact that they are looking for something different, something new, and something that is not reflected right now on the Science of Math webpage, I think is something we need to look at.
So I'm back with Sarah Powell, and I just want to get her reactions and input on some of the things that I was talking about with Rachel. So Sarah, thanks for being back.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate the opportunity.
And as you can tell, we could talk about this for days and days.
We could, but I don't know if people would listen to this for days and days.
So I've narrowed it down to just a few things that I would like to get your reactions to. First of all, I do want to talk about the context of the United States. This came up in our conversation earlier, but
Yep.
came up with Rachel as well. We love math teachers. We know they're doing their best job they can. A lot of them are doing really excellent things with students and giving them an opportunity to learn mathematics.
Yeah.
But we also know that all of us kind of want to raise our game, and we wish that the United States math performance could be a little bit higher, a little bit stronger.
Or a lot higher and a lot stronger. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're all kind of joined together on that. But what I wanted to ask you is something that came up with Rachel, which is how would you diagnose the underwhelming sort of results in mathematics? What do you think are some of the root causes, thinking like on a broad national sort of scale?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I spend a lot of my time in K-5 classrooms and a little bit of time in middle school classrooms. So I'm going to speak from my experiences there. And I think you have a different perspective working with students in the older grades. So maybe you could share that after I finish here. But one of the things that I see is that there's been maybe like some limited use of really high quality systematic and explicit instruction that is engaging and giving students real-time feedback. We see a lot of things used where students are working in centers or in workshops, and they may not actually be getting as much instruction as necessary to lay a proper foundation in mathematics. And I've also seen a move away from working with fluency. Some teachers will, comment to me like they've been told or they're afraid to ask students to memorize their facts. That's one of the big things that always comes up. And when students don't have some of that foundational knowledge, it just makes things harder, things in their grade level harder, especially related to word problem solving and application of math knowledge. But also then it just gets harder and harder with every grade level, which is one of the reasons I believe that we see that in grade 4, there's a large number of students that struggle with math, but there's even more students that struggle with math by grade 8. And that's because of that cumulative nature of mathematics. If students don't have that strong foundation, which I see is really important to establish through really good high quality explicit instruction, it makes math harder so that by the time those students get to grade 12, we've got more students struggling with math than students who don't struggle with math. And that's a disappointment in the United States. I also think a second big thing is related to school supports. I'll say schools, but we're talking about districts, also talking about states. There's been such a focus on reading, and I don't want to get my reading colleagues upset. Maybe they listen to the math podcasts as well. Reading is important, and it should be a big focus in schools, but schools have invested so heavily in reading blocks. So many times schools have a 90-minute reading block, and you can't do anything during that reading block during the day. Not all schools have the same thing with the math block. Not all schools have a math interventionist as they have a reading interventionist. Many schools have intervention time, and most of the time, that time is used for reading intervention and not math intervention. And I think also in teacher training, there's a lot of times where teachers say they receive a lot more professional learning and coaching on reading than they do on mathematics. And so all of those things contribute to less of a focus on mathematics in schools. And I see less and less support in middle school and high school, which is probably what you see as well. I imagine you run into very few high schools where they have an intervention time for math, so that if students do have that math difficulty, we can help students at that time to move them forward. So I would say that there's some things that happen within the classroom that have led to some of that lackluster math performance, but a lot of things that happen at a structural level at the school and district where we aren't as focused on math as we could or should be, and that has contributed to some of those lower achievement results as well.
The main thing I appreciate hearing from you is that you're talking about an absence of some of the things that you think would be productive, both in instruction and also with school investments and sort of a structural level.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you aren't saying it was like it's a takeover of NCTM based instruction or something like
Yeah, I
that.
haven't
Where
said that. No.
where
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, everybody's doing the NCTM vision of, some sort of inquiry-based, student-centered instruction, and that by taking over the classrooms across the country is why the performance is low. So that's not what you said. And to me, I'm glad to hear that because, yeah, I was realizing with my research teams for now many years, we've looked at over 500 lessons in like 8 different states, mostly in middle school and high school classrooms.
Yeah.
And we do not see the NCTM instruction at all. Like,
Yeah.
what NCTM vision of having rich tasks and having some
Hmm.
groups work on it, and then they share out what they discovered or what they've
Yeah.
tried, and then the teacher brings it together into this discussion that really like summarizes and encapsulates some math ideas. We do not see that at all. Like, I'm talking over 500 lessons, like about 0% is that
Hmm.
kind of instruction.
Yeah.
So I think actually we might be a little bit closer to the same page of like what we're seeing on there.
Probably.
But to me, it's just important to check that you're not saying that because so many NCTM recommendations are getting taken up, that that's the problem. Now, you are pointing to a few things, though. You're seeing a few trends, like away from memorization or away
Hmm.
from some fluency, which you're characterizing as a problem. I also think there's a role for memorization.
Yeah.
Like, I do think at some point there's some things that hopefully you can have automaticity, you can have real quick access to it, which can open up, the space to do some other interesting mathematical
That
things.
allows you to get into mathematics in a more involved or deeper way.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of conversations in math right now around cognitive load. And I'm glad those conversations are going on because when students don't have foundational skill, whether that's knowing that 2 plus 3 is 5, or that's knowing a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that slows everything down to then prohibit you, or maybe like just make it harder for you to engage in some of those, like more as you're talking about, like more, what did you describe them as, like rich tasks and
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
And I do see that it's all a balance, right? You do have to have that foundational skill. And I agree with you. Some of those things do have to be memorized so that students can go on and be more successful in more tasks that may revolve around inquiry.
Yeah. And then to just check myself too, I think it's important for folks like myself to not say that explicit instruction is rampant and that that's the problem with math instruction. Because as you're saying, the explicit instruction that's happening there is not necessarily what you would endorse as the kind of explicit instruction that you're
Yeah,
trying to
I think
promote.
I would just say it's like instruction.
Hmm.
I mean, we see like some instruction, but then a lot of things where students are working in small groups or in partners, but they may not have, especially I do a lot of work in word problem solving. The students don't have a strong enough background in word problem solving to really engage in the task in a fruitful way. And so that is just an inefficient use of a lot of students' time.
Hmm. If listeners are interested in this kind of conversation too, I'll point them to my colleague Chuck Munter's work, where he brought together folks from the explicit instruction side, direct instruction, and he brought folks together from the dialogic instruction side to really hash out, like, what do you mean by the kind of instruction you're envisioning?
Hmm.
And it was really elucidating because it was showing that each side had a impoverished view of what the other side was
Yeah.
actually promoting, and it's important to realize what they're actually trying to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that probably what you're talking about and that I'm talking about and that Rachel's talking about, we're probably much more close to a center of a pendulum that swings back just a little bit and forth than these very wide arcs. And yeah, so I think we're probably, there's more commonalities here than we always are aware of.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I also recognize, though, that you are not the same as everybody else who maybe takes on the science of math moniker. Some
Yeah,
folks
that's
are not
true.
as diplomatic
Yeah.
about it, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. Well, people have different backgrounds and people work with different groups of students. So all of my research occurs in general education classrooms with almost all general education students, a few who may have an identified disability. There are other people out there that work with different groups of students, students who do have an identified disability or, yeah, just different groups of students, maybe students who excel in mathematics, and there might be different approaches to teaching those students. So I think we have to be always very clear of what's the population of students that we're interested in. And I'm interested in general education students who struggle with mathematics. And right now, that the data shows us that that's the majority of kids in the United States. And so, what is the approach that's going to be the most beneficial for that very large group of students?
I had another question on this similar topic of kind of understanding each other and trying to make connections across the two sides. So one of the things that came up with Rachel was this notion of discovery learning
Yeah,
or discovery based. And Rachel was concerned that sometimes people use that term thinking it's like a free for all or thinking that it's like
yeah,
totally open inquiry where the students are
yeah.
just sort of going around. And Rachel was really talking about the importance of guided inquiry, and she said that that
Hmm.
word guided is very important, that there is a structure, there's instruction that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to get your reaction to that terminology of discovery learning versus like guided inquiry.
Yeah, so I am not sure of the difference between discovery and inquiry. So I think that's a operational definition that we would need to define. But what I will agree with Rachel on is the idea of things being guided. Now, maybe where we need to sit down and have some good conversations are what does guided mean? I think that there are times where part of the guidance is going to look a lot like my explicit instruction, right? And my explicit instruction might look a lot like her guidance. There also might be some divergences there, but that goes back to, a really good article that looked at they use the term discovery learning. It's the Alfieri et al. 2011 article where they compared unassisted discovery to explicit instruction, and they saw that explicit instruction was beneficial. Now, what was that explicit instruction? Was that more of like a guided inquiry? Another conversation probably for another time, but I think that we all agree here that some level of guidance at some points in students' mathematics day is important. I see that guidance through a framework of explicit instruction. I think Rachel sees that guidance through guided inquiry. And I bet if we looked at her guided inquiry lesson guide for something and my guided inquiry lesson guide for word problem solving, we'd probably see more similarities than we would differences.
And that was part of Chuck Munter's work too, is that they actually realized we have some things in common, even though they thought they were starting from like totally different ends of the
Yeah, it goes
pendulum,
back
as
to
you
the
said.
whole idea of false dichotomies, right? And many times we are talking about these false dichotomies. Like, is it conceptual or is it procedural? Well, it's actually both. Is it, this or that? And we need to just have some conversations where we are noticing the overlap and then trying to maximize those points of overlap, but also realizing for some students, some of the time, there might be some different approaches that need to take place, and we have to be okay with that as well, because every student is a unique individual, and we don't always want to have just this one size fits all approach for every kid.
Mhm. One area that people point to as a sort of difference between some math educators and then the science of math sort of group is around some of the strands of proficiency.
Yeah,
Like, for example, productive disposition, where it's like, okay, we really want to try to help students have positive attitudes, feel good about math, feel like they're included in the space, the math community.
yeah,
And so Rachel also brought up this point about the five strands of proficiency, which are the procedural fluency, but also conceptual understanding, strategic competence,
yeah.
adaptive reasoning, and then productive disposition. And the question was there, does the evidence base that's kind of underlying the science of math, does that focus more on the procedural fluency, or is there the most evidence procedural fluency, or how do you see connections to some of the other strands?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sam. I see that well, and I think that there's a lot of evidence out there about this, is that procedural learning and conceptual learning are really deeply intertwined with one another. And really, there's no true conceptual task, just as there's no true procedural task. And all of the intervention work that I do with teachers and students out in schools and that my team helps on, we are teaching concepts and procedurals basically in tandem. And I think the third part of that rope that is pulled in there is often about that strategic competence. Like, so what are some of the strategies that I can use to approach solving this word problem? Or what are some of the strategies I can use to represent fractions or add and subtract fractions? And so I really see that they're so intertwined that it would be very difficult to unpack them. And I don't think that any of the evidence out there is truly looking at only procedural knowledge in the same way that there's no intervention out there that's truly looking only at conceptual knowledge, just because you cannot have one without the other and you cannot measure them separately. So that would be not exactly how I would characterize a lot of the research that I know that appears on the Science of Math website. And then I say that adaptive reasoning really follows that foundation. So once you have a good foundation in your conceptual and procedural knowledge, then like how can you adapt or transfer that to other situations? And then really as students improve their mathematics learning, then their efficacy improves and many times their anxiety decreases. And so that gets into that whole idea of productive disposition. So I see that those two other parts of the rope likely follow a strong foundation in mathematics, although you're working on them a little bit as you are teaching mathematics, but I wouldn't spend just a lot of time talking about productive disposition. Instead, I'd spend a lot of time teaching students mathematics so that that productive disposition improves in a way alongside as their mathematics improves.
Okay. I think that's a fair way to think about it. There is kind of a lead position, like the procedural fluency is central to a lot of the measures that are used, but then you're seeing it entwined with some of the other strands,
Yeah.
and that having an increase or improvement in the procedural and the conceptual or the strategic competence that you're starting, like it will bring along some productive
Yeah.
dispositions along the way. Now, there's also the possibility of that being falsified. Like there could be possibilities where somebody's really working on procedures in a certain way that it's increasing their scores in that realm and they're starting to hate it. So like there it's potentially
Yeah, it could
falsifiable,
be.
but it's
Yeah,
also potentially but it
potentially.
also could
Yeah.
happen that like no, as they're getting better, they're feeling better about the subject.
Yeah, for the most part, I think there's quite a bit of research that shows us that. And as you talk about a lot of procedural tasks, if we're talking about maybe a computation measure, yeah, as you look at it, that looks very procedural, but you have to have conceptual knowledge of what does it mean to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. You often are pulling in your conceptual understanding of what does it mean to regroup, right? And this is where it's like, are students thinking conceptually or are they not? It's really hard to have a true task that is only procedural in the same way that it's really impossible to have a task that is only conceptual. And I think I always go back to something Brian Ponce said on another podcast that I've listened to, where he's like, if you can't measure it like in a good way, then you can't really say that that intervention is leading to that outcome. And what he's saying there is that like you don't have a truly procedural task. So it's not just testing procedures. Any task that students are doing in mathematics is really a combination of conceptual and procedural knowledge. Sometimes might be a little bit more weighted on the procedural end of things or a little more weighted on the conceptual side of things, but you're pulling in both of those sources of mathematical understanding every time you're doing anything in mathematics. And so I can't just say like, oh, that's a procedural task. Like that just truly doesn't exist.
All right. Before we kind of go into our concluding comments, I did want to also just ask you about the website itself and maintaining the website. Like,
Yeah.
for example, if new evidence came forth, would the new evidence possibly be incorporated into the website?
Yeah, I'd love that.
Or
Yes.
if something on there needs to be clarified, is there like a process for revision or where does that stand? And I know that you have a full-time job that is not just maintaining the website.
I
So.
do. I feel like I sometimes have several full-time jobs, and one of them is not on the Science of Math website. There's no staff for the Science of Math. That was a true volunteer effort. And as I've said before, a lot of that came during and as we were coming out of the pandemic, where most of us were not in schools all of the time and spending so much time working with teachers and students because schools were doing different things at that time. Yeah, so there is no staff. And would I like the resources on the Science of Math website to be updated? Yeah, I mean, there's research that's come out in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years that would be nice to have on the website. So, maybe one day we will get some funding to update the website. But I think that, the Science of Math website is a good place to go to for getting some conversation started, but it is not the end all be all, certainly in no respect. And so there's lots of different ways that we can access resources related to research validated practices, and we should be continually having conversations of what the evidence is going to tell us. I think one thing that I think about often is the role of technology. If we do this in 2035, we're probably going to have a very different conversation about what's going on in mathematics. And so, like what I say in 2025 about the role of technology in the classroom probably will be different what we say in 2035. And so that might be true also around instructional approaches and, ways that we teach students in fractions and ways that we teach students in word problem solving. So I think that's one of the cool things about educational research is that it is always evolving to some extent, but we're also still adding to this tremendous research base that is there and that we shouldn't ignore as well.
Well, I've been speaking with Sarah Powell from the University of Texas. And Sarah, I do just want to sincerely thank you for taking the time, multiple iterations to join this episode.
Oh, thank you, Sam. It's very nice to talk with you. Yeah.
Well, I also know it's not easy to open yourself up to critiques and conversations, but I do appreciate you just coming into this conversation with a positive mindset and having a good faith conversation about some important topics in math education. It's been wonderful and very invigorating also.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to see if you had any final thoughts or any closing remarks that you wanted to make about this topic.
Well, just thank you for the opportunity to talk about a science of math, which is related to this bigger idea of a science of learning and the evidence-based practices that are there to support learning. I would just say that math is absolutely essential. There's a lot of students in schools that excel with mathematics, but there's also a lot of students that have difficulty or struggle with mathematics. And particularly for those students that do struggle with mathematics, it's really essential that we rely on this strong evidence base of practices that are out there. And we can't let these kids down, and the time to act is now. We can't wait around for the next research study to be done because we have that strong evidence base. Like, let's rely on that now, and it may change over time, but we absolutely have to help these students out so that they can be successful not only in school but also beyond.